Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's Black History Series presentation titled Fact and Folklore, Old Wash and Kingsville's Black History with Veronica Brown. According to Veronica, she is a volunteer at the Kingsville Archives and has been a researcher for the Kingsville Municipal Heritage Advisory Committee since 2008. She specializes in built heritage and historical properties. While researching, Veronica has been known to trip and fall down a history hole, sometimes not emerging until the wee hours, which I can completely relate to. Before we begin, I ask that while Veronica is presenting, if everyone could please mute your microphone, just so that it doesn't distract or have an echo. And then following her presentation, there will be a question and answer period. So you can just type in your questions in the comment section or even raise your hand and I'll call on you. And at this point, of course, you're welcome to turn your microphone on. And just one final note, if you would like to support programming such as our Black History Series, you can go to our website and donate. It's amherstburgfreedom.org. So now I'm going to pass it over to Veronica. Thank you again so much for being here with us today.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. I just need to, one of my slides is not going to come up. So I may have to just, all right, we'll get this going.
Not a problem.
Okay, so thank you for having me. This is very exciting for me because this gave me an excuse to look into Kingsville's Black history. It was something I always had in the background, especially since we're going to be talking about Henry Washington, who is a beloved character here in Kingsville, but also gave me the opportunity to expand upon his story and the story of Black history in Kingsville. Now, I just want to, I don't know why my slide did not do it, but I'm going to just put here just historical language advisory. So I'd like to begin with a caution. This historical language advisory is adapted from the Library and Archives Canada website. So certain parts of this presentation contains historical language and content that may be considered offensive or potentially harmful, such as language used to refer to racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. The content and descriptions reflect the period in which they were created and the views of their creators. These references retain their original descriptions to ensure that attitudes and perspectives are not erased from the historical record. So there will be nothing too offensive, but definitely a language of the time. So if we can go here, from here on out, it should be work out. So if there's any problems with my slideshow, please let me know. So we're going to start with Old Wash and his obituary. So to the right is an actual photograph of Henry Washington. To the left is the article that was from the Windsor Star. They referred to him as Uncle Wash and that he died at the advanced age of 107. So you can read that for yourself. I'm also going to be reading right now from his obituary from the Kingsville Reporter, which was from August 31st, 1916. So it says, Henry Washington, Kingsville's only colored resident, passed away this afternoon. He was the oldest man in the county, anywhere from 100 to 118 years. Henry was at one time a slave in the South, but made his escape to Canada perhaps 60 years ago or longer, and had since resided in Gosfield South or in Kingsville. He acquired some property here, which he held until a few years ago, when he sold it to Mr. C.A. Quick. Mr. Quick put him up in a little house where he lived until his death. In the early days, he worked and supported himself. Laterally, however, for some years, he had been growing feeble and was not able to work. His wants were few and simple, and no one refused him anything he needed. He was around the streets as usual until a week ago when he was taken to his bed, and the slowing down process began. When Dr. Jenner visited him at noon today, he found him very weak but able to talk, and told him he had not long to live. Well, said he, I am taking the world easy, and I'll soon be in the happy hunting ground. And those were some of his last words recorded. According to his obituary, the town is giving him a Christian burial in Green Hill Cemetery tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Mr. Charles A. Quick is paying all his funeral expenses. So when I'm talking about Gosfield South and Kingsville, I thought we would go back to the beginning to give some context about this area. So here we have a map of Essex County showing the water frontage surveys of the 1790s. So this part of the county was surveyed into lots that were available to United Empire Loyalists. And as you can see, they were basically the northern part of the county, and then also the southern part along Lake Erie. And these were, the lots that people wanted, and they were first surveyed out in the area. So by the 1820s, the rest of the county had been surveyed into lots, and then that's when we got these townships that you see in this map right here. This map is from 1881. So we're getting more localized here. So Kingsville now was originally called Gosfield. It was the township of Gosfield, and it was divided into farm lots that contained 200 acres, except for some of the lots along the lake, which were more or less 200 depending on the coastline. But so these were the farm lots, and this is how they were distributed if people wanted to purchase them or apply for some grants. So here we have a map that was created in 1832, and it logged the owner of some of these farm lots. And as you can see, again, the lots closer to the waterway and to Lake Erie were the ones that were most desirable. So you see the northern part, except along some of the lakes, they were free and open. And so some people, when they look at some of the lots, they wonder, how people got them as close to the lake as they did. And it really depended when you got here and petitioned for your lots. So to go back a little bit, so while researching Colonel James King, after whom Kingsville is named, I was given this resource from the Freedom Museum. Thank you, Mary Catherine. This is an excerpt from an 1856 book called The Refugee, Narratives of Fugitive Slaves in Canada. And again, going back to the township of Gosfield, now Kingsville, it shows that Gosfield had 78 citizens of color. And interestingly to note that all but 2 or 3 families were freeholders, which meant that the land they were working, they actually owned. It was not leased to them. And regarding the Black population, Colonel King is quoted as, quote, "They are good, loyal subjects and good, honest people. They are as moral as any people. There is no fault to be found with them at all." So this really got me interested in these early Black settlers based on this and how, they integrated into the rest of the community. So shown here are some of the Black property owners as of 1861. So as a researcher, I decided to use this year because this is the year of the 1861 census, and it recorded the race of its residents so that I was able to determine who were people of color that lived in Kingsville. And I also had access to the property assessment rolls. So highlighted here are the areas owned by these families of color. So the freeholders, and also gives a number of acres. And then I've shown this map here to show you exactly where these properties were located. And it was interesting to show that it is actually quite close to the town center of Kingsville, not further up north. They were able to get some pretty good property here. And this map also shows the location of the Salem Section School, which was established in 1864, and the Shiloh Baptist Church, which was established in 1868. So we see a community coming together here, but they were also living amongst white settlers as well. So in fact, the Salem School was a mixed school. There would be both white and Black children attending this school. So this just gives me an idea of what property was owned by people of color in 1861. But I was able to go back and identify, because I was really interested to see when some these Black settlers did come to this area. So I wasn't able to see when they originally arrived in Gosfield, but I went back and was able to research these properties and determined that John W. William, he purchased his land here in Gosfield in 1837. Thomas Johnson Sr., he got his in 1847. Lewis King in 1849. John Chapman in 1851, and Henry Washington in 1861. So this is how, we got the people, how they were able to come here before, I have the documents from 1861, because prior to that we have very few documents. Even our earlier census records were destroyed for this area. So this was the best I could do as far as documenting when perhaps people came to the area. So we talked about the Shiloh Baptist Church. So the Baptist Church was established in 1868. And it was on land donated by Mingo Jacobs, a very successful local farmer here. The Jacobs family was around quite a bit. And they had to set up the church itself that shows that the trustees were John Williams, Eli Johnson, Willis Norris, Henry Washington, Francis Lyons, and John Blankenship, which were all, names of early Black settlers here in the area. So speaking of Henry Washington, we're going to go back to him right now. And in 1861, even though he did own property in Gosfield, he actually lived in Kingsville, and he was a domestic servant of the Augustine family. And you can see at the top part, it shows Henry Washington living with them. So he had property in the north, but he still lived in Kingsville. Again, he was this handyman, and he would go around and work for various families. Now, at the bottom of this slide shows the Land Abstract Index, which is basically what the Land Registry Office would use to record transactions on a parcel of land. So highlighted in green from 1870 shows Solomon Weigel selling 15 acres of land to Henry Washington. And also highlighted in green at the bottom, which I thought was interesting, is the mortgage that he took out on this property. And he took it out with James W. King, who happened to be Colonel King's son. So there was a lot of interaction between the King family and Henry. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but it just seemed to be that he was friendly with the family and other families in Kingsville and Gosfield. So in 1873, Washington purchased the lot on the corner of Division Street North and Beach Street, which he would go on to live at for over 40 years. And so this is the 1850 plan of Kingsville. This is kind of our four corners, our downtown, and highlighted in yellow is Washington's lot that he purchased outright and he lived in. So very close to the town center. So to talk a little bit about Henry Washington, he was a beloved character, and he was often wrote about in the local newspaper and in very affectionate terms. So it was almost like he was a character that people took their cues from. So for instance, in the 1890s, it was reported in the newspaper that Old Wash, our only colored citizen, has shook both of his overcoats, and which was a sure sign that spring season is on. And then later in the 1890s, it talked about our only colored citizen, Henry Washington, had blossomed out into a real estate magnate. He purchased the Cascadon property on Pearl Street a few days ago for $160. Mr. Washington does not intend to occupy his new property, but will remodel and otherwise improve his present residence. So he's still owning property in the north, some farmland, and he's also accumulating property within Kingsville itself. And again, this is a picture of Henry Washington, courtesy of the Kingsville Archives. Another picture of Old Wash that the Kingsville Archives has. And again, in affectionate terms, he is talked about in the newspaper. So in 1897, it was reported that our only colored citizen has been to Toronto Fair and enjoyed himself immensely. And then in 1898, it was reported that Washington, our only colored citizen, has taken in the excursion to Ottawa this week. So he's also rather well traveled, and he got around. And again, he seemed to collect people as he went along. Again, from the Kingsville Reporter is from 1907, is our old colored citizen, Henry Washington, while sawing wood Monday last, had a fainting spell. It only lasted a few minutes. So there would be talk in the newspaper about always letting people know what he was up to, and if they were worried about him. If he was sick one week, they would definitely report on that he wasn't well. And then later that same year, it talks about that Old Wash has discarded his overcoat and hung it in the refrigerator, which is a dead sure sign that summer is here to stay. So he was almost like a barometer in town. He was affectionate, beloved character, and people took their cues from him, I believe. And people like to get their picture taken with Old Wash. And this is Mr. Healy, that later went on to become mayor of Kingsville in his adulthood. So people had a lot of affection for him. So by the 1910s, Washington was becoming frail and unable to work. So a local businessman, Charles Quick, purchased Washington's lot in 1912 for $260. So this is that corner of Division North and Beach Street that we had seen before. So included in the deed was, quote, subject to the right of the grantor to use and occupy for the term of his natural life the east 61 feet thereof, being a portion of said lot lying east of a certain maple tree. So the property, because he did not have any income, was not able to work. Quick did purchase the property, and he gave him permission to live on the property until he no longer needed it. So the following year, in 1913, there was a reference saying that our old colored friend, Henry Washington, has a new house and is cleaning up his premises in good shape. So when we see this map here, we see that the yellow home on the north side of Beach Street, that is Henry Washington's new home. Presumably, he was able to build it because of the money he received for his lot. And then the rest of the lot was used by Quick as warehouses. So we have those small concrete buildings. So Quick was able to use the property as well, but he did portion off a piece for Old Wash to use for himself. Here we have a provocative photo of Old Wash. In 1912, there is an article from, unfortunately, an unknown publication, but we do know it's from 1912. And it does reference the fact that he is very much respected by the citizens of the town, as he has been a faithful servant to many of them. Now, as at his advanced age, his chief occupation is visiting the young women of the town and telling their fortunes. He claims that he has been the means of making many matches among the young people. So this is also how he would, he could no longer do labor, but he would go around and tell fortunes if people wanted to. And they look very happy, although I'm not sure what the lady holding the brick is doing, but, and we may never know. So again, from the unknown publication dated from 1912, it talks about Washington being the oldest man in Canada. So Henry Washington, whose picture is given herewith, is believed to be the oldest living man in Canada today, if not in America. He is 116 years of age and resides at Kingsville. So as he got a little bit older, his stories became larger than life. And so I was trying to kind of go back and find out, obviously he came from the United States. Obviously he would not have any papers, and presumably may not have information about when he was born. Exactly, specifically. I will say that in looking at old documents, that in the 1901 census, Washington's birthday was listed as the 15th of June, 1825. But to go back further, throughout the 1870s and 1880s, we have documents that show Washington's year of birth as being 1830. And then in the 1890s, the year of his birth was recorded as 1835. So I'm not sure about the fluctuation back and forth. It could be that, you know, as he got older, he wanted to appear younger, perhaps for work situations. But then it was in the 1900s that his age became exaggerated. But it was always reported with affection. So from the Windsor Star, 1912. Henry Washington, a well-known colored citizen of Kingsville who attended the Emancipation Day celebration at Sandwich, claims to be the oldest man in the whole of Canada. Washington's birthday is on August 19th, and if he likes, he will be 116 years old on that day. The oldest residents of Kingsville say they can remember Washington as far back as 1850, and at that time he was gray-headed and bent. The old man was sold into slavery at the age of 4 in Kentucky, and for 46 years was owned by a Southern planter. He escaped to Canada previous to the outbreak of the Civil War. So there is kind of a winking nod to the fact that, if he wants to say he's 116, that's fine by us. So we will, perhaps never really know how old he was. But at this point, I think it's, I don't think it's necessary. I think it's rather charming. So we were talking about Black ownership in Gosfield, and I wanted to share the legacy. So for as long as I've been doing history in research in Kingsville, I have been told that Kingsville did have a sundowners law, or the fact that after the sun went down, people of color were not allowed to be in Kingsville. And it was presented to me as a bylaw. This was something that the town had kind of put on. And we do know that Washington was allowed to live in Kingsville until his death in 1916. But I think it's very curious that he was always referred to as our only colored citizen. And I wasn't sure if that was an early example of virtue signaling, kind of like, okay, we're still good people because we have this one Black gentleman that lives here, but the other people were not, tolerated or invited or allowed. So I have been on the hunt for documentation as far as how Kingsville really felt about the people of color being in Kingsville. I do know that in 1900, when the House of Refuge was being built, so that was considered the poorhouse for the county, it was being built in Leamington. I remember at the time in 1900 reading that there was an unwritten law in Leamington that Black people were not allowed to live in Leamington. So what about people coming from the northern parts? There's a few people of color that will be coming from Bell River to live in Leamington, and what are they going to do about these people? So again, I'm not sure if Kingsville could get away with saying that about another community because they had their Black friend that lived in town, and it kind of let them off the hook. So I haven't been able to find a bylaw endorsing the lack of Black residency in Kingsville. However, I will say that Kingsville was separate from Gosfield South, so the southern part of Gosfield. And Gosfield South was until amalgamation in 1999. So I'm going to be referring to the parts along the lake here. So this is a map of Kingsville east of Division Street. And so this part was formerly Gosfield South. And so beginning in the 1920s, a lot of these farmers were taking chunks of their farms that were right along Lake Erie and converting them into subdivisions. Some of the farmers did it themselves, and then sometimes investors or property developers from Detroit, from Windsor, would buy up these properties and then break them down into subdivisions. So some of these developments included covenants within the deeds that addressed certain things like size of houses, construction materials, how close you can build to the road, and other things like that. And one of the covenants that were included in some of the deeds are race restrictions. So I'm not going to read these out, but these are examples from actual deeds from the 1920s till the 1930s. I will say that between 1921 and 1937, there was 17 subdivisions developed along the lakeshore, and I went through deeds for every one of those subdivisions, and out of 17, 7 of the subdivisions had these race restrictions. I believe that part of this was they were trying to sell these properties to Detroit residents to build, summer cottages and things like that. But nonetheless, it's still, very disturbing. And I think perhaps when people talk about this bylaw happening, that Kingsville did not allow Black people to live in Kingsville, I'm wondering if it kind of had its roots in these deeds. Now, I will say that at no point when the deeds are issued does the town or municipality sign off on these deeds. These are considered private agreements between private citizens. Now, the Land Registry Office will record them, but that's just as far as land transfers, not endorsing any of these race restrictions or anything. So I was a little bit, disturbed to see these, especially in very stark terms like this. But I was even more aggrieved to hear that these kind of agreements or covenants within deeds were upheld by the courts until 1950. And here we have an article from 2015 honoring the end of real estate racism in Canada. And this is because this plaque from Historic Sites and Monuments from Canada, Board of Canada and Parks Canada, was put up in London to celebrate the fact that real estate racism had ended. So I'll be giving you some information from this Toronto Star article. So the watershed real estate case began in April 1948 when Bernard Wolfe, a successful London, Ontario businessman, signed an agreement to buy a cottage property in the exclusive Beach O'Pines subdivision on the shores of Lake Huron near Grand Bend. So these race restrictions were happening all over Ontario, probably all over Canada. At the time, he hired young Edward Richmond, fresh out of law school, to handle the $6,800 purchase of this cottage. So Richmond's title search disclosed a registered restriction in a 1933 deed. It provided that the land could never be sold, used, occupied, or rented by any persons of the Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Negro, or colored race or blood. The stated purpose of the document was to restrict the use of the cottage community to, quote, persons of the white or Caucasian race, end quote, not otherwise prohibited by the restriction. So Richmond began an unopposed court action to void the restriction. He represented Wolfe, and then a lawyer, John R. Cartwright, who later became Chief Justice of Canada, represented the vendor, Annie Noble. So although the two lawyers agreed with each other that to, void the restriction, the court upheld the validity of the restriction. They said it didn't offend public policy, and the freedom to contract was not to be lightly interfered with. So this is coming from the Ontario courts. So Cartwright and Richmond appealed to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and in January 1949, the Court of Appeal gave a hostile hearing to both lawyers. This is from the Toronto Star article. Barely disguising the anti-Semitism that was so prevalent at the time, 5 justices of the Ontario Court of Appeal agreed with the trial decision and noted that the racist restriction was just to assure that the residents were, quote, of a class who will get along together, end quote. The case was then brought to the Supreme Court of Canada, who accepted the one lawyer's argument that it was not possible to determine with certainty whether the buyer was, quote, of Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Negro, or colored race or blood. So the Supreme Court of Canada reversed the decision of the two lower courts and declared the covenant invalid, not because of racism, but invalid because of uncertainty. So because you couldn't ascertain the race of someone, there's no way of enforcing it. And it also ruled that the restriction was an illegal restraint on an owner's right to sell. Again, not noting the racism in these restrictions. So meanwhile, while this was going on in the courts, in the Supreme Court of Canada, the Ontario government bowed to public pressure because this started, we're talking about after the Second World War and what people had seen and heard of. There was a lot of public pressure to erase these the legalities of these covenants. So the Ontario government bowed to public pressure as a result of this case and passed a law voiding restrictive covenants entered into after March 24th, 1950, but it did not cancel the older ones. So it's only when a deed is transferred or someone else buys it and the deed is being rewritten that it will be struck off. But if people still in the family have the original deed pre-1950, it will still be included in the deed that's the latest in the land registry office. So that was very interesting to me and rather disturbing. And I'm pleased to say that it was such a historic case that they do have this plaque that takes place in London, talking about Noble and Wolfe versus Alley. So, you know what, we're going to get back to Henry Washington, because even after his death in 1916, Henry Washington continued to be a beloved character in Kingsville. So this is a short story that was published in 1939 by the Star Weekly in Toronto. It was written by Walter Scratch, who lived in Kingsville until he left in 1922 to attend university, and then he went on to the States, and he was a writer and a journalist. So this story was published in 1939, and then it was syndicated and published throughout Canada and the US. So I won't have time to read it to you unless you guys ask me to, but it's very interesting to me because it starts out talking about Old Wash. Now, it does disguise the fact that we're talking about Kingsville. It refers to the town as Erieville, but it talks about Old Wash. He called himself George Washington. He was the only Negro in Erieville. He was the lone survivor of a band of escaped slaves that had fled north before the American Civil War. So it goes into a little bit of background of Old Wash, but then it turns into a fictionalized version of events. And he becomes the main character in this missing brooch that turns into a courtroom drama where he is then vindicated. And I think it's just very interesting that in 1939, that this person elected to tell a story where a person of color is misjudged, who is accused wrongly, and ends up through his own experiences being able to be deemed innocent of any crime. I thought this was very interesting that in the 30s that this was happening, when in fact we're still having the race restrictions in some of the local real estate itself. So, it just shows you that the influence that Old Wash had on young boys at the time, especially. Because we have this painting of Henry Old Wash Washington that is actually a part of the Freedom Museum's collection. So it was painted by a Kingsville resident who would have been a young boy when Old Wash was alive. His name was Forrest Ride, and he painted this painting that ended up going and being donated to the Freedom Museum. And I'd like to end this presentation with a snippet from the Kingsville Reporter in 1916. This is before Old Wash had died. And again, it just sums up the affection that the community had for him. So, quote, "A little lad last week inquired of his father the meaning of Good Friday. He was told it was the day the Savior was crucified. But, said the father, that was a long time ago, and there is nobody living now that was living then. What? Said the astonished Kitty. Wasn't Old Wash? So it just goes to show you that he was a topic of conversation, and I believe very beloved in the community. And I would like to just share with you some of the research resources that I used in coming up with this. Using the Canada Archives, the census records, property assessment rolls, Land Abstract Index, which is available free online. We have deeds and property records that are held by the Kingsville Archives, and then local newspapers like the Kingsville Reporter, Amherstburg Echo, and the Windsor Star, and then the Historical Atlas for the County of Essex 1881, which is where I got a few of my maps. And now I'd like to open it up to any questions anyone might have.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Veronica. I'm really glad that you talked about like this contradictory nature of Kingsville with, well, we are going to welcome this one person kind of as like a symbol or figurehead, but we don't want anyone else. So I appreciated the contradictory nature of Old Wash's story. And I apologize if you've already mentioned this part, but you'd mentioned that he was the sole survivor when he had escaped enslavement, but did he have any family connections when he came to Canada? A spouse or anyone that he maybe reconnected with once he arrived in Canada?
No, and it's very hard to really document it, because later in life he told these grand stories, and sometimes he talked about being in the South until he was in his 40s, and then he was going to be sold, and then it didn't happen, and then he pistol whipped the son of the master, and that's when he escaped. So I think he just, as things got along, I think his stories got grander. He never did marry. There was a reference to the fact that he did not get married, but that's not for lack of trying. You know, he said he did like the fairer sex, and it just kind of never happened. So there is just a lot of contradictions. So he is kind of, almost turned into like a fairy tale almost, or not. I think a human being with with agency. I think he was maybe just treated like a mascot in town, and the early ideas, the early records just are not there, and it was basically little was talked about him until later on, and then that's when he started talking about being 116 or perhaps 120, and then each time he kind of told its story, it got more elaborate. So we're really not sure when he exactly came to Canada, or any kind of families.
Okay, and that makes sense. Yeah, there's sometimes the documentation is just not there.
Hmm.
So I can understand what you're saying. And I did have one more question, and then another comment. Um, the comment was, I do really appreciate you talking about the sundown laws, because again, people don't see that as being something that happened in Canada, and real estate discrimination, which is still a problem, which I find it amusing that the Toronto Star declared that it was ended in all of Canada. I think that's
Hmm.
absolutely hilarious that they declared it on behalf of the entire country when it's still a
Hmm.
problem. But I do appreciate the fact that you talk about, even though you're not finding any records that show the bylaws, you're showing these deeds that showed like the difference between, I guess you could say, even though it's through the laws, because the court systems would have to uphold it, as you said, but they
Hmm.
didn't endorse it. So it's kind of legal, but more so socially enforced by the community. So I do really appreciate the fact that even though there isn't this obvious example of the bylaws existing, that you're pointing out this different form of more socially privately enforced discrimination that happened in there. Because again, people don't see it as something that is happening in Canada when it absolutely did and still does. So I do really appreciate that example. And my question was, in terms of Old Wash's presence currently, I mean, you'd mentioned significant or extensive research you've done in the archives, but outside of the archives and the records you mentioned, is there any presence of Old Wash in Kingsville today? Like any recognition of him?
No, I think people who kind of know their Kingsville history, if you talk to some older folks, they'll be like, oh, yeah, of course, Old Wash. Every once in a while in the newspaper, they will show, the Kingsville Archives is really good about sharing photos of him, and they'll publish it. So going through every few years, they kind of retell his story a little bit. And it's so wonderful that we have the photographs, because it really puts a face to it. So yeah, but as far as an actual presence, no, not really like a physical presence.
And
In
I
fact,
appreciate, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, in fact, he is talked about being buried in Green Hill Cemetery, which is a very large cemetery here, but we do not know where he is. There is no cemetery marker.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
at first, I thought, okay, unmarked grave, and it seemed very sad. But then, in talking with other people, that's not unusual, because at one point, some of the cemetery records had been destroyed by a fire. So there's also other people who have family members who don't know where they are buried, and that there are no markers there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
And
so I'm very interested, because it's easy to kind of jump to, oh, it's because he was black. And then when you go and talk to other people, like, no, I have a great great grandfather, and I know he's buried there, but we just don't know where.
wow. And also, too, going back to what you'd mentioned about the photographs that have been preserved at the archives,
Mhm.
those are some really amazing photographs that you shared because I'll admit, other than newspaper articles and the painting that we have here in our collection, I hadn't seen some of those original photos that you shared today. So I appreciate you sharing those as well.
Mhm.
And if there's anyone in the audience who has a question or comment even, you're welcome to either turn your mic on and ask your question, or if you wanted to type it into the chat. We have a comment from Willow Key, who is an amazing researcher as well, who's done some amazing work with the McDougall Street corridor. She says, great presentation, Veronica. Did you come across any other Black residents that stood out in the archives related to Kingsville?
So Kingsville does include Gosfield South. So we do have the Salem community. So people do know we do have a Black cemetery here in Kingsville. It has been designated by the Heritage Advisory Committee. And it is called, when it was designated 20 years ago, they reached out to the Amherstburg Museum, and it was deemed appropriate to call it the Negro Cemetery because that's how it was referred to. So we do have the Black Cemetery here that is protected. I would love if anyone is, one of my slides did show some of the families, like the Jacobs, the Johnsons, and some of those early families. Some of them did stay here in Kingsville, Gosfield, Kingsville, up until the 40s, 50s, 60s. We did have Black residents here. And I do have a lot of information through these property records. It's amazing the property records we have and the things we can find. For instance, if someone passed away and one of the children inherited the property or decided to buy out the other people, there will be a quit claim deed from all the other relatives. So I have access to deeds where it shows such and such person who lives in Detroit, such and such person who married this person. So you almost get like a little family tree just through the property records. So if anyone is interested in more information about these Kingsville families, I'm more than happy to share my information with people. I think it's very exciting.
I have a feeling that the person whose question I'm going to ask from next, Dr. Adam Aronson, he does some amazing work cross-border, the United States and Canada, research and connecting them. And he has a question. He says, in my research, I've seen two African North Americans in Gosfield both before 1865, Albert Radcliffe with a T, and
Okay.
Joshua Johnson. Did either of them come up in your research?
Yes, I do have stuff on Johnson. Radcliffe, not so much. Now, I will say that I have an 1842 census for Gosfield, but I was hesitant to use that information because I wasn't totally sure about which of those folks were of color. So if we can maybe even link up and I can talk to you to see if they're included in the 1842 census. I also have an 1850 assessment roll that does talk about who was living in Gosfield at the time. But Johnson's a big name. And I do actually have an obituary for one of the Johnsons that kind of explains a bit of the story about coming to Canada from the South and escaping enslavement. So I'm more than happy to share any of that stuff. The difficult part about this presentation was just culling it down because I have so much more that information, including going through the old census records, because sometimes when they're talking about race, some people are referred to as colored, some people are African, some people are mulatto. So I went page by page through them and just documented anyone that was of color. So, if you're looking at the index, sometimes you don't get the full story. So I have lists of all the people of color from the different census records that I was able to compile. I'm more than welcome to share that as well.
Fantastic. So Willow and Adam have both said that they will be in touch. So Willow and Adam, with your permission, I can share your email with Veronica following the presentation. So just let me know that that's okay. Yep, Adam Aronson says yes.
Fabulous.
So okay, perfect. And we do have, and Willow says yes as well. So I will share those with you after your presentation so that you can get in touch. And we did have one person who was just typing in a comment, but it looks like they have stopped typing. Yep, so they have stopped typing their comment. So, but if you do have any other questions for Veronica, please feel free to reach out. There's no other question. Oh, actually, they've started typing again. Sorry about that. Oh, they said so interesting. Thank you so much. So,
Well,
so
thank you
excellent.
very much.
Yeah,
If
that was
it's up to the people that are here, but if you guys have a couple minutes, I will be more than happy to read you the story of Old Wash because it's fantastic. The short story about him. Anyone up for the story?
I am if you are. Yep, we've
It's
got a sure in the audience. So if you want to go ahead and read it, absolutely.
wonderful. Okay, so let me get to it. Um, okay, so actually, can you see my screen?
I
Okay,
can
it
see
doesn't matter.
research resources.
Yeah, okay, so you can kind of, I'll read it, but you can kind of follow along a little bit. These are from my notes. So the name of the short story is South Wind. So Erieville called him Old Wash. He called himself George Washington. He was the only Negro in Erieville. He was the lone survivor of a band of escaped slaves that had fled north before the Civil War and finally reached this little fishing village on the Canadian shore of Lake Erie. Nobody knew his age. Old timers remember sitting on his knee when they were children. Now their grandchildren did the same. The older Old Wash grew, the more his mind reverted to the past. He couldn't recall the 80 or 90 years he served as handyman to a dozen Erieville families, but he'd talk about his arrival as if it were yesterday. We'd jump off the boat, he'd say, and fill our pockets with ground. We rubbed the dirt in our hair and raised our hands and shout, "Hallelujah, praise the Lord, we are free." Now, this is interesting. So it says Colonel Green's grandpa. So just from doing research, Colonel King would be the person that Old Wash would be his contemporary. And interestingly, Colonel King's granddaughter married a gentleman called Green. Now, he was not a colonel, but it would make sense that, you know, if he's talking about Colonel Fanny King Green's grandfather being the thing. So that's why when it talks about Colonel Green, I'm assuming it's Colonel King. But Colonel Green's grandfather gave us the land down along the creek for our cabins. And Old Wash had one obsession. He feared south winds. That fear dated back to the year after his escape from slavery. It was the year a schooner sailed across Lake Erie from Sandusky, Ohio, under the direction of one Kentucky Smith, owner of the escaped slaves. The Negroes took to the bush, but not before 3 of them had been captured and carried back. So after that, no Negro ever ventured near the lake when the south wind blew. And I will tell you that Colonel King's granddaughter and her husband, Curtis Green, they lived right on the lake of Lake Erie. So they lived right down by the shore. So, and after Old Wash's mind did that flip-flop that landed him back in his pre-Civil War past, the old fear returned to him. Old south wind, he'd say with a shake of his cotton white beard, does not bring colored folks nothing except bad luck. That's what he said the day they accused him of burglary at Colonel Green's place and found Mrs. Green's diamond brooch in a pocket of his age green overcoat. Old Wash used to eat in the kitchen of Erieville's oldest families. At the time of the burglary, he was showing a preference for the concoction of Colonel Green's Swedish cook. So every night, except when the south wind blew, he'd eat in the Greens' kitchen while the family dined inside. It was Marius Peabody, Colonel Green's new secretary, who induced Constable Bartrell to search Old Wash after the burglary. When the constable found the brooch, Old Wash just shook his head dumbly and muttered, "Old south wind does not bring colored folks nothing except bad luck." They put Old Wash in the village lockup. Constable Bartrell said he had no choice but to comply with the law. Besides, Peabody testified he saw Old Wash loitering around the house after his evening handout. The light. The burglary occurred on the cook's night off, and the Greens had motored to the city. But Peabody, under the orders from the colonel, was obliged to feed the Negro from leftovers in the icebox, he testified at Old Wash's trial. The judge was ready to turn the case over to the jury when Colonel Green got the court's permission to question the accused in an effort to find out where the rest of the loot was hidden. "Wash," he said, "what's this you told the judge about the south wind?" "Old south wind," Wash repeated, "doesn't bring colored folks nothing except bad luck." Now, Wash, the colonel persisted patiently. How could the south wind bring you bad luck? It's been 80 years or more since the sailing boat came here to recapture your old friends. Old South Wind, the Negro insisted, must have put the brooch in my pocket. Then Colonel Green saw the light. Your Honor, he exclaimed, do you realize what Old Wash is trying to tell the court? He's saying that there was a south wind the night of the burglary. That means he wouldn't go near the lake because of his superstition. That means he didn't take his meal at my house that night. In fact, he thinks the evil south wind put the brooch in his pocket. Headline, The Stranger. Half of Erieville was in the courthouse and everyone started to talk at once. There had been a storm off the lake the night of the burglary. They shouted about broken windows, uprooted plants, wrecked chimneys, all on that night. When the bailiff finally quieted them down, Colonel Green asked permission to continue. Your Honor, he said, we residents of Erieville know of our fellow citizens' fear of the south wind. We would never accuse him of committing a crime near the lake when the south wind was blowing. No one would accuse him but a stranger in Erieville. Yes, Your Honor, the man who accused Old Wash is a stranger. Peabody made the open window in 2 leaps, but the bailiff caught his coattail as he went through. He held on until Constable Bartrell collared the culprit outside. Peabody confessed the crime then and there and admitted slipping the old brooch in Old Wash's pocket the day after the burglary. Constable Bartrell tried his best to explain things to Old Wash. He held the glittering brooch close to the old fellow's eyes and said, see, Wash, the south wind is giving it back to Colonel Green. Old Wash stared fondly at the trinket. Old south wind, he sighed, doesn't bring colored folks nothing except bad luck. What do you guys think?
Wow.
It turned into a courtroom drama.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, so amazing that, I mean, you're right that this was 1939, you said?
1939.
Yeah. That he would be the subject and portrayed in that light. I mean, wow.
Yeah. It was incredible. I'd seen a reference to this story from the 1950s, and I scoured the internet trying to find this story, and I was so happy that I found it because it was amazing. To make him the protagonist, the wronged, victim, and I just thought, and it just showed the affection that the town had for this man. And it does kind of allude to the fact that as he got older, maybe trauma, maybe some dementia or something happened where maybe he, was more delicate as he went. And maybe that's when these stories got bigger and bigger. But I just think it's a fabulous story. And I was not expecting the courtroom drama.
And I appreciate you continuing your search to try and find the actual story. I mean, you'd said you'd heard about it in 1950, and then
yes, in 1952 it just said, oh, and by the way, someone wrote a story about Old Wash, and it was published in a newspaper. And so I was like, okay, I need to know more.
Well, I appreciate you continuing your search so that you could actually find the story, because we get to benefit from that today. So, and again, thank you so much for presenting this research. I have learned a lot myself about Old Wash. I will say I knew a little bit about him, but you have opened my eyes to so much more information about Old Wash, and we're getting several comments in the chat saying thank you, and thank you everyone as well in the audience for joining us today. Again, this is recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube page. And Veronica, I will send you the contact information for Willow and Adam as well, who I'm sure cannot wait to hear more information from you. And again, thank you so much for giving this presentation today. We greatly appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was an honor to speak with your group.
Great.